Have you ever stopped to think that behind the splendor of Rome, there was a dark world that almost no one talks about? Perfect roads, imposing colosseums, coins shining in the hands of the powerful. All this only existed because thousands of men were swallowed by the mines, living in dark tunnels, breathing dust, carrying stones until they died. It seems contradictory, doesn't it? The same civilization we admire for its engineering and culture also rose on the invisible suffering of its miners. While today we discuss quality of life, labor rights, and technology, the Romans sustained their empire with endless working hours, incurable diseases, and relentless punishments. It's a cruel paradox. The glory of a few depended on the agony of many. And this little told story poses a direct challenge for us. Are we somehow still repeating the same cycle today? Get ready, because throughout this video, you'll delve into details not found in textbooks. We'll walk together through stuffy tunnels, feel the weight of loaded baskets, hear the sound of pickaxes echoing in the depths. You'll understand that Rome wasn't just marble and gold, but also sweat, dust, and pain. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it in your city? I want to know how far this hidden story of Rome is reaching. He would wake to the dull sound of tools striking the rock, even before sunrise. Life in the Roman Empire revolved around resources, and mines were the invisible heart that sustained the city's luxury. It was curious to think that while some enjoyed banquets in Rome, others dug in the dark for those silver cups to exist. This contrast alone shows how wealth and suffering walked side by side. In distant provinces, such as Hispania, the landscapes were different from the bustling streets of the capital. Reddish hills, sediment-laden rivers, and small villages surrounded the mining areas. For those who lived there, the constant smell of wet earth and dust was more prevalent than any market fragrance. Today, when someone complains about waking up early to work, they may not realize that centuries ago, people already started their day inside a dark mine. On the other side, in Egypt, the scene was completely different. The dry, almost unbearable heat made every step a challenge. Sand seeped into the lungs, and the lack of water turned work into an endless punishment. Imagine someone sweating in the desert, breaking rocks, while today, many of us have air conditioning and ice-cold water at the touch of a button. It's in this kind of comparison that one realizes how much modern comfort is an almost invisible privilege. The routes connecting these provinces to the central cities were long and tiring. Caravans carried metal on mules, crossing mountains and valleys until they reached the ports. The sound of squeaking wheels mingled with the lowing of tired animals. It's even comparable to modern logistics. Today, we have trucks, ships, and planes, but the essence is the same, moving wealth from where it's produced to where it's consumed. It was precisely this geographic diversity that kept the empire supplied. Hispania, with its silver-rich mountains, Egypt, with gold hidden beneath the sands, Gaul, with iron deposits that would shape swords. Each corner had its role, and together they formed the mosaic of Roman greatness. Thinking about this is like looking at a chain. Each link may seem small, but without it, the structure cannot hold together. And yet, behind this splendor lay stories of sweat and silent resistance, stories that often don't appear in books, but which shaped the daily lives of millions. Because if today we know Rome for its marble columns and paved roads, it was precisely what happened in the mines that laid the foundation for all this. And it's curious to note how this hard work took on even more meaning When one considers the people forced to perform it, the day began with the weight of obligation. For the Roman Empire, every bit of metal extracted was priceless, and it was this value that sustained the engine of expansion. But for those who worked there, what glittered represented just another sleepless night and another aching body. It's curious how something that in the market seemed synonymous with glory, in the mines meant only wear and tear. The wealth produced didn't stay anywhere near the hands of those who generated it. The miner woke early, ate little, and entered airless tunnels, knowing that each blow to the rock meant more coins to fill the imperial coffers. It's like observing certain low-paying professions today. Those who work the hardest rarely receive a salary commensurate with their effort. The difference is that back then, the option to quit simply didn't exist. Economic value came not only from the metal itself, but from what it represented: power, gold financed wars, silver ensured currency circulation, iron kept the army armed. It was as if each gram extracted was a small brick in the wall of Roman greatness. However, if for Rome it was a symbol of strength, for the miners it was just dust in their lungs and calluses on their hands. There was a clear paradox. The more valuable the activity to the empire, the more painful it was for the individual. Today, we might think of professions like doctors in war zones or divers on oil rigs. Society needs them, but the human toll is extremely high. Roman mining was this same game of unfair exchanges, only magnified by the lack of any care for the workers. The sounds inside the galleries were not the clink of coins, but the repetitive echo of pickaxes striking stone. The smell was not of wealth, but of humidity and sweat. Economic value was converted into daily suffering, invisible to the eyes of those who walked the streets of Rome. This contrast reminds us that behind every symbol of luxury lies a story of sacrifice that rarely appears on the surface. And this is precisely where an intriguing question arises. If mining was so valuable to the empire, who were the people assigned to such backbreaking labor? After all, someone had to sustain Rome's wealth, and it wasn't always free-willed citizens who filled that role. When someone opened their eyes inside a Roman mine, what they saw was not brightness, but darkness. However, behind that darkness lurked metals that changed destinies. Silver, gold, iron, lead, and copper each played a vital role in the empire, like pieces on a chessboard. The curious thing is to realize how, for Rome, these elements were almost like blood running through the veins of a gigantic body. Silver was the heart of trade, transformed into coins. It passed from hand to hand, connecting distant markets and sustaining caravan routes. Imagine walking into a Roman tavern and paying for wine with a coin that months before was hidden deep in the earth of Hispania. Today, when we use cards or instant transfers, we forget that the idea of money was born precisely from this transition from stone to hand. Gold, however, carried even greater symbolic weight. It wasn't just metal, it was prestige, it was power. Crowns, jewels, and even offerings to the gods depended on it. If today we say time is money, back then, gold was literally but to reach an emperor's chamber, someone had to carry it in heavy baskets, feeling the heat run down their body in the form of sweat. Iron, in turn, shaped the army's destiny. Sharp swords, sturdy spears, sturdy armor. None of this would exist without the metal veins extracted from the mine. When we think of the discipline of the Roman legions marching across the world, we must remember that every hammer blow on an anvil originated in the effort of those who dug iron from the depths. It's like looking at a full stadium and forgetting who built the steps. Lead and copper had quieter but equally important uses. Lead appeared in plumbing, and even utensils without anyone knowing its health hazards. Copper, mixed with tin, became bronze, the base for statues and tools, small details that made up the daily routine of an entire civilization. From the water that ran through pipes to the bell that resounded in a square, everything was linked to these distant mines. And what was most fascinating was how these metals, so essential to Rome, were invisible to most citizens. The population saw only the final product, not the suffering that came before. This chasm between appearance and reality becomes even more cruel when one discovers who were, in fact, responsible for extracting these riches from the hard soil of the empire. Inside the mines, there was no distinction of origin or culture. Many were men who had lost battles against Rome and now paid the price in silence. Enslaved, prisoners of war, voiceless, the life they once had, whether in villages in Gaul or fortresses in the east, was left behind, replaced by the constant sound of pickaxes against stone. Freedom became but a distant memory. It's curious to think that while Roman generals celebrated victories in packed squares, the defeated marched toward dark tunnels. The destiny of some was triumph, that of others exhaust. Today, when someone loses a job or faces a crisis, it feels like the ground is falling apart. But compared to those times, losing literally meant being buried alive in forced labor with no choice. These men didn't just work, they survived. Their bodies grew accustomed to carrying stones, but their minds fought the idea that this would be their future until the end. Many created small routines of hope, humming songs from their homeland, saving a piece of bread for later, imagining the faces of their family. It's impressive how human beings, even in the cruelest situations, find ways to endure. At the same time, there were also those who were sold in slave markets and quickly sent to the mines. The price of a life was measured in coins, as if it were just another tool. Have you ever thought about that? Today we buy cell phones, cars, or houses. Back then we bought people. It's a shock that makes us reflect on how much the concept of dignity was a late achievement in human history. Unlikely bonds emerged between them. Prisoners from different ethnic groups learned to communicate through gestures, shared food, and even created silent codes to warn of danger. These small alliances helped them bear the weight of their day. It's like in life today, when someone faces a heavy routine, having company and support makes all the difference. Shared suffering becomes somehow less unbearable, and precisely because they were people without rights, subjected to total neglect. The conditions inside the mines reached unimaginable levels. The lack of light, the stifling air, the constant humidity. If living there already seemed cruel, imagine trying to survive in an environment that resembled more of an underground prison than a workplace. And that's when we begin to understand what it truly meant to live daily in such an unhealthy environment. Upon entering a Roman mine, the first sensation wasn't of wealth, but of suffocation. The air was heavy, thick with dust and humidity. The darkness was almost absolute, interrupted only by torches releasing smoke and more heat. Imagine spending hours breathing that air, with no windows, no wind, just the breath of dozens of tired bodies. The space was more prison than workplace. The humidity soaked everything: clothes, skin, even tools. The smell was a mixture of wet earth and accumulated sweat. Anyone who's ever entered a damp basement or natural cavern can probably imagine some of that suffocating sensation. But the thing is, there was no easy way out. Those inside the mine had to hold out until the end of their shift, even if each minute seemed endless.
The lighting was poor. The torches provided little light and consumed oxygen, making the air even harder to breathe. With each step, shadows were cast on the walls, creating the sensation that something was moving around. Some ancient accounts mention accidents caused by simple tripping, as the narrow corridors did not allow for good visibility. Today, in any building, we have safety standards. Back then, safety wasn't even a consideration. Besides the lack of light, the heat became unbearable. In deep mines, the air became stagnant, and it felt like being trapped in a humid oven. Imagine working with a sweaty body, clinging clothing, and no way to change gears. Today, we complain about crowded public transportation on a hot day. Miners experienced this for hours on end. Without relief, the body responded to this hostile environment with disease. Respiratory infections were common, and the skin was marred by wounds that were slow to heal. Even the eyes suffered. The smoke from the torches and the fine dust impaired vision over time. It was as if each day of work robbed them of a little of their health and dignity. The environment didn't just wear them down, it slowly destroyed them. And this scenario leads us to reflect. If the physical space was already so hostile, what were the imposed workdays like without breaks, without care, only with the demand to produce more and more? The sun hadn't even risen yet, but the miners were already awake. There were no wristwatches, but the pace of work was marked by the shouts of supervisors and the accumulated fatigue in their bodies. The day began early and dragged on long after dark, a seemingly endless routine. It was as if time belonged to the empire, not to those who breathed within the mines. Breaks were minimal, almost non-existent. A piece of stale bread, sometimes a sip of murky water, served as a quick break before returning to the pickaxe. It's curious to compare this with modern routine, where even labor laws establish rest hours. Back then, rest was seen as wasteful. The body was just another tool, and tools, in the Roman view, didn't need a break to function. Fatigue mounted with each blow. Hands developed deep calluses, muscles burned, and the mind drifted into daydreams, trying to escape the monotony. Anyone who has worked long hours in a grueling job can probably imagine the feeling, but with one difference. There were no weekends, no vacation. There was only tomorrow, which would be the same as today. In many cases, miners worked until exhaustion knocked them down, and when they fell, they were dragged aside and replaced by someone else, with no right to recovery, no assist. Today, in the workplace, we have discussions about burnout and mental health. In ancient Rome, burnout wasn't a concept, it was a silent death sentence. The repetitive sound of tools against rock became almost hypnotic, one beat after another, like a metronome that never stopped. And amidst this incessant rhythm, the body grew accustomed to living without pause, as if trapped in an iron gear. This gear turned in favor of the empire, but slowly crushed those who moved. And if the human effort already seemed heavy, it got even worse when one thought about the rudimentary instruments available, which required twice as much brute force to achieve any result. Inside the mines, there was no sophisticated technology, just simple instruments that required excessive force. Iron picks, heavy hammers, and improvised levers were the main companions of those who worked there. Each blow echoed off the walls as a reminder that nothing came easy. Today, when we use electric machines or modern equipment, it's almost unimaginable to think that everything was done with just one arm. Tools wore out quickly, and miners had to adapt. A broken wooden handle, a dull blade, and still the work continued. There was no time for careful repairs, only improvised patches. It was as if someone were forced to run a marathon in torn sneakers. The effort was already absurd. With precarious tools, it became almost inhumane. The sound of pickaxes against rock was repetitive and deafening. With each strike, tiny sparks flew, mixing with the dust suspended in the air. Anyone who has ever broken down a wall or demolished concrete knows how tiring it can be after just a few minutes. Imagine then repeating that effort for hours, days, and years with no prospect of change. Your body became an extension of the tool. And then there was the weight of symbolism. For Rome, those tools represented progress, but for miners, they were invisible chains. While some saw in them the promise of wealth, others saw them as instruments of oppression. It's like a keyboard today. For some, it's a tool of creation and freedom. For others, it can be a symbol of suffocating routine in uninspiring jobs. It all depends on who holds the object. Even with such limitations, the Romans managed to extract impressive quantities of metals. This demonstrates human resilience, but also reveals the cruelty of the system, because if so much wealth was extracted from the earth with rudimentary tools, imagine the price paid in sweat and human lives. The shine of the coins hid the darkness of the tunnel, and it is in this contrast that another important detail emerges. It was not just the act of extracting, but also of carrying tons of stones to the certain conditions that seemed to test the limits of the human body. After breaking the rock with heavy tools, came the part that seemed even more thankless, carrying what had been removed. The miners filled wicker or leather baskets with chunks of stone and raw ore. The weight crushed their shoulders. Their spines creaked as if they might snap at any moment, and their slow steps resembled those of pack animals. But they weren't animals. They were people, though treated as such. These baskets lacked any ergonomics or comfort. They were rough, with handles that cut into the skin and left deep marks. Some improvised cloths to ease the friction, but nothing really helped. Anyone who's ever carried a heavy shopping bag home can imagine the pain in their arms after just a few minutes. Now multiply that effort by hours underground without fresh air. The journey to the surface was a challenge in itself. Narrow tunnels, uneven steps, and the darkness made each transport a test of endurance. Many slipped, spilled part of their load, and were forced to start over. Frustration was part of the routine, as if the mine were constantly reminding them who was in control. Today we use freight elevators, conveyor belts, and trucks. Back there, it was just muscle against tons. And then there was the repetition: loading, climbing, unloading, returning, loading, climbing, unloading, returning. The cycle seemed endless. Like a human hamster wheel, the body grew accustomed to the movement, but the mind lost itself in the emptiness of repetition. It's the same feeling as in modern mechanical jobs, where the routine is more exhausting due to monotony than physical exertion. Only, back then, there was no paycheck to compensate. Even under such a heavy load, some created small strategies to they shared the load among more than one person, helped lift fallen baskets, or even exchanged words of encouragement along the way. These small gestures made a difference in days that seemed endless, because in the end, it wasn't just the stone that weighed them down, but the knowledge that the journey would never end. And this idea of carrying and carrying leads us to another scene. In certain places, Rome even used animals to help in this process, replacing part of the human effort with animal strength. In a contrast that also says a lot about the value of life at that time. In the more structured mines, Rome incorporated animals into the heavy work. Oxen, mules, and even horses were tethered to pulley mechanisms, moving in endless circles to move loads of stone or pull buckets of water. The sound of creaking chains, mixed with the animals' measured steps, created an even more somber atmosphere. It was a repetitive, endless cycle from which neither man nor beast found rest. These animals weren't treated as partners, but as mere cogs in the machinery. They received little food, suffered from injuries caused by tight harnesses, and were worked to exhaustion. Anyone who's ever seen a pack animal pulling a cart on a steep road can imagine the scene. The difference is that in the mine, there was no horizon or open sky, just tunnels and the weight of the ore. The use of animals helped increase production, but it also demonstrated the empire's ruthless logic. Everything was harnessed: human power, animal power, and even the natural landscape was molded to serve mining. Today, when we talk about automation or machines replacing people, we think of efficiency. Back then, technology was simply putting one mule in place of 10 enslaved people. And there was a curious detail. Miners often became attached to their animals. In the silence of the tunnels, the presence of an ox or a mule brought some kind of companionship. Some shared pieces of bread or spoke to them, as if conversing to ease the burden of loneliness. After all, when everything around seemed cold and hostile, even a beast of burden could become a friend. Still, wear and tear was inevitable. Animals died early, replaced by others, as if they were disposable. This utilitarian vision reinforces how the empire viewed everything based on the result. For Rome, life itself wasn't important, but how much it could produce. And it is at this point that another fundamental question arises: if even animals were exploited to the limit, imagine how the Romans dealt with more complex problems, such as the accumulation of water inside the mines. Water was a constant enemy within the mines. It dripped from the ceiling, accumulated on the floor, and turned passages into veritable underground swamps. To deal with this, the Romans developed drainage techniques, but all in a primitive way. Buckets, improvised canals, and even hand-powered water wheels attempted to contain the problem. It was like trying to drain ice. Each day, the mine seemed to swallow back what had been extracted from it. Miners spent part of their time not only breaking rocks, but also extracting water. Imagine working exhausted and, instead of resting, having to fill buckets and carry them out. Today, when a basement floods, we use electric pumps in minutes. Back then, it took hours of back-breaking labor just to keep the space usable. The mine always imposed its own rhythm. The most advanced solutions included wooden contraptions and pulleys, powered by animals or slaves, that lifted water into containers. Even so, the process was slow and inefficient. Many galleries ended up abandoned because they became too flooded. It was a cruel reminder that despite all Rome's power, nature continued to impose limits. Man could build roads and aqueducts, but underground, water had the final say. The humid environment made everything even more unhealthy. The musty smell mingled with the smoke from the torches, and the miner's skin was constantly soaked. Illnesses easily arose: fevers, colds, infections. Anyone who has spent a long time in wet clothes knows the discomfort. Now imagine this as a daily routine, with no way to change clothes or warm up in the sun. The humidity was unforgiving. This water problem made the work seem even more futile. After hours of carrying stones, the miner would see part of the tunnel lost to internal flooding. The effort seemed to dissolve along with the mud. It was like running on a treadmill. Lots of movement, little result. And yet, Roma persisted, because every gram of metal was worth the sacrifice of dozens of bodies. And if water represented a persistent obstacle, there were also places where the scale of mining became so grandiose that it required even bolder solutions, especially when it came to gold extraction in regions such as Hispania River in Hispania. The natural landscape was no longer the same. Entire hills were modified to satisfy the Roman Empire's thirst for gold. The sound of running water mingled with the clang of tools, creating a harsh symphony that echoed day and night. There, mining reached impressive proportions, so great that even ancient geographers recorded its magnitude. Gold wasn't just a resource, it was synonymous with absolute power. Every gram extracted from the Tigris fueled the luxury of the Roman elite and financed military campaigns that expanded borders. It was as if the river were an open vein, gushing wealth directly into the imperial coffers. Today, when we talk about strategic reserves, such as oil or gas, it's impossible not to recall this historical parallel. To reach the gold, Rome spared no effort. They used techniques that diverted the course of water to erode the slopes, a process devastating to nature. Imagine waking up in a nearby village and seeing the neighboring mountain literally dissolve before your eyes. The grandeur was impressive, but the environmental and human cost was enormous. The miners, in turn, faced seemingly endless journey. The glitter of gold that enchanted emperors only meant more weight to carry in mud-soaked baskets. The contrast was cruel. The same metal that glittered in temples and palaces was the same metal that crushed columns and lungs inside the mine. It's as if every coin had two sides, one of splendor, the other of suffering. And it wasn't just the opulence that drew attention, but also the scale. The Tagus became a symbol of how Rome explored its limits, as if nothing were enough. When we think of modern engineering projects, such as hydroelectric dams or large dams, we see distant reflections of this boldness. The difference is that today, at least in theory, there is debate about impact and preservation. Back then, there was no room for such concerns.
This obsession with Hispanic gold paves the way for another curious detail: the creativity of Roman engineers who developed ingenious systems of canals and aqueducts to enhance hydraulic mining. In the gold-rich regions, Rome wasn't content with pickaxes and baskets alone. Imperial engineers, with an almost futuristic vision for the time, developed complex canal systems that diverted entire rivers. Water, in vast volumes, was directed against hillsides and mountains, crumbling them and exposing hidden ore veins. The sound of the tamed river mingled with the rumble of the earth's subsidence. These projects required planning and thousands of workers. Imagine miles of canals being dug by hand just to transport water to the exact point of the mine. It was as if each drop were an invisible tool, extracting the riches from the earth. Today, when we look at dams or irrigation systems, we can see echoes of this Roman ingenuity, albeit applied in very different contexts. The technique was impressive, but also devastating. Entire mountains were destroyed, and the natural courses of rivers were forever changed. Those who lived nearby saw their villages swallowed by mud and sediment. Nature, which once provided food and shelter, became an unpredictable enemy. It's curious to note how Rome, while dominating the world, paid little attention to the ecological legacy of its actions. For miners, hydraulic mining posed even more danger. Sudden landslides, uncontrolled torrents of water, and rock avalanches turned the work into a daily game of Russian roulette. If we fear floods in modern cities today, imagine being in the middle of a deliberately created torrent with no chance of escape. Risk was part of the job, and the empire brooked no delay. Despite this, the results were impressive. Tons of gold extracted in less time, sustaining Rome's military and political machine. Efficiency trumped any human or natural loss. What mattered was the gleam of the metal reaching the hands of the powerful. And behind this engineering spectacle was always the same question. How long could the human body endure working under such brutal conditions? And this question leads us directly to the next aspect, the cruel fate of so many miners who often succumbed young, overcome by the weight of disease and fatigue. The lifespan of a Roman miner was short, often cut short by the hostile environment. Bodies wore out quickly, like torches that burn brightly and go out early. Youth, which elsewhere might signify vigor and a future, here became just more labor force to be consumed. It was common to see men in their early 20s already looking elderly, marked by wrinkles, scars, and profound fatigue. Diseases struck mercilessly. Lungs filled with dust, bones fractured by landslides, infections caused by untreated injuries. There were no doctors on hand, much less medicine. Cures often came only through luck. Today, at the slightest sign of a sore throat, we have pharmacies open 24 hours a day. In the mines, a simple fever could mean the end of the line. The physical exertion was brutal. Imagine spending 10, 12 hours carrying stones in baskets that weighed almost as much as your body. Your spine would bend, your muscles would tremble, and your heart would pound as if it were about to explode. Many would collapse midway through the journey, overcome by exhaustion, and when they did, there was rarely any compassion. They were replaced without ceremony, like broken cogs in a machine that couldn't stop. The stolen youth left its mark not only on bodies but also on the community's memories. Entire families were torn apart, with parents and siblings taken to the mines and never seen again. For those who remained, all that was left was to wait for news that almost never arrived. It's painful to think that, while Rome erected golden statues in its temples, entire villages mourned silent losses. If we talk so much about quality of life today, that was precisely what didn't exist for those miners. The concept of well-being was unimaginable. They lived in the present, without planning for the future, because they knew tomorrow was too uncertain. It's as if each day were a loan too expensive to repay. And when it came to disease, it wasn't just fevers or accidents that were frightening. The very air inside the mines carried invisible poisons, responsible for making people sick and taking lives even more slowly. Breathing inside a Roman mine was like swallowing sand every second. The dust kicked up by pickaxes lingered in the air, seeping into the lungs and causing constant coughing. There were no masks, no protection. Every breath was a risk. Every sigh carried a bit of invisible poison. It was impossible to spend years in this environment without breathing becoming labored, heavy, and painful. The thin air in the deeper tunnels made the situation even worse. The deeper the men advanced, the less oxygen there was to sustain their struggling bodies. Many fainted mid-work, collapsing as if the air itself had become an enemy. Today, when we enter stuffy spaces and immediately feel short of breath, we have the option of leaving. Back then, the only choice was to keep going or die trying. Respiratory diseases weren't diagnosed as we do today, but their signs were clear. Chronic cough, phlegm, shortness of breath, and even loss of voice plagued miners. What we now call silicosis or pneumoconiasis already existed there, just without a name or treatment. It was a slow punishment, transforming strong men into frail figures, incapable of carrying even their own weight. The smell of mold and smoke from the torches completed the toxic atmosphere. Deep breathing brought no relief, only a burning sensation in the throat and eye. To cope, some wet cloths and placed them over their faces in a desperate attempt to filter the dust. It was a simple trick, but ineffective. Anyone who has ever entered a dust-filled building knows how suffocating it is. Now imagine living in that day. These illnesses slowly robbed workers of their vitality. The cruelest thing was realizing that even when they were already sick, they were forced to continue working. There was no sick leave, no compassion. The body was used to its limit, and the limit was almost always death. And if respiratory diseases were already devastating, there was another silent element, more insidious and persistent, that affected entire generations: constant contact with lead extracted from the bowels of the earth. Lead, so common in Roman mines, seemed harmless to those who handled it. It was used in plumbing, coins, and even household utensils. But inside the mines, lead dust infiltrated everything: the air, skin, and food. Miners breathed in and carried particles without knowing that, little by little, lead was poisoning their bodies. Today, centuries later, scientists still find traces of this impact in the soil and rivers of the ancient mined regions. Interestingly, Rome saw lead as a symbol of progress. It was cheap, malleable, and easy to work with. Roman engineers used the metal in aqueducts, believing they were creating lasting solutions. However, without realizing it, they were spreading a silent poison that affected both workers and the population. It's as if each advance came with a hidden price, paid only many generations later. In the mines, contact was daily and intense. The dust stuck to sweat, entered the lungs, and burned the throat. Many miners presented symptoms of poisoning without understanding the cause: headaches, weakness, tremor. Anyone who has suffered from food poisoning can imagine the discomfort. Now imagine it continuously, without pause, slowly eroding your life. The impact wasn't limited to humans. Animals used for transportation also became ill, and rivers that received waste carried poison to entire communities. Today, we speak of industrial pollution as a major environmental challenge. Back then, without awareness or regulation, lead mining spread without limits, leaving scars that modern science is still investigating. And what's most impressive is the durability of this toxic legacy. Ice cores in the Alps, for example, reveal lead particles dating back to Roman times. This shows how each extraction not only affected the present, but also extended through time, reaching even today. The past continues to breathe, even if in the form of silent poison. And if lead left invisible traces in the air and on the ground, other metals, such as silver, played an even more visible role in Roman daily life, shaping the empire's very economy. With each piece of silver extracted from the earth, Rome ensured the flow of its economy, and metal was taken to the minting workshops, where hammers and molds transformed the raw ore into gleaming coins. The metallic sound of these blows echoed through the cities, reminding everyone that the empire's wealth had a very concrete basis: the sweat and suffering of the miners. It was as if each coin carried the weight of entire lives buried in the tunnels. These coins circulated throughout Roman territory, from east to west. They were used in markets, for soldiers' salaries, and even for taxes collected in the province. Imagine walking into a market and paying for bread, wine, or olive oil with a small piece of silver that weeks before had been hidden inside a mountain. Money took on an almost magical symbolism, connecting distant worlds. Silver was not only a means of exchange, but also a symbol of power. Having coins meant access, influence, and possibilities. It's curious to compare with today. While many still value gold as a store of wealth,
The Romans saw silver as a force for everyday life. It was present in every transaction, sustaining what we now call the real economy. But deep down, its origins evoke the deepest inequality. For the miners, however, silver was just dust in their eyes and a burden on their shoulders. They never saw the metal's final shine. They only knew its raw form, mixed with rocks and mud. It's like a modern worker who produces luxury goods, but can never afford them. The paradox has always existed. Those who generate wealth rarely enjoy it. And then there was instability. When the mines produced less, the value of the currency fell, generating inflation. Rome felt the consequences of the mine's depletion in its pockets. Thus, even those who had never set foot in a dark tunnel were somehow affected by the pace of mining. The entire empire revolved around this metal, and if silver fueled commerce and urban life, other metals, such as iron, had a very different fate. They were molded into weapons and tools that sustained Roman military power. Inside the Roman forges, the heat was so intense, it seemed to melt the air itself. Iron extracted from the mines was transformed into swords, spears, and shields that would march alongside the legions. Each hammer blow on the incandescent metal served as a reminder that behind military discipline lay the invisible toil of miners. The same iron that supported walls also sustained Roman domination on the battlefield. Copper, in turn, gained another strategic purpose. Alloyed with tin, it was transformed into bronze, useful for helmets, armor plates, and even musical instruments used to coordinate troops. Imagine the metallic sound of trumpets echoing before a battle, a sound that intimidated enemies and organized soldiers. This sound originated from the same metal that days before was sweatily extracted from the tunnel. The curious thing is to see how different metals complemented each other within the military logic. Iron provided brute strength, while copper brought malleability and resistance. Together they formed an arsenal that placed Rome ahead of many conquered people. Today we speak of cutting-edge military technology. Back then, innovation was found in every piece of precision-molded metal. But for the miners, the noble purpose of their extraction mattered little. They didn't see the shine of the polished sword, only the dust that choked their lungs. It's like a modern worker who builds luxury cars but rides a crowded bus.
The contrast between those who produce and those who consume is as old as history itself. The impact was enormous. More weapons meant more conquests, and more conquests brought more prisoners who would return to the mines to keep the cycle going. It was a vicious cycle of iron and blood, in which labor in the bowels of the earth sustained expansion above it. Metal wasn't just a resource, it was strategy, it was empire, it was destiny. And if iron and copper were vital for war, gold had an even more seductive role, fueling the luxury of palaces and financing military campaigns that expanded Roman horizons. Roman gold wasn't forgotten in dusty coffers. It circulated in the form of bars, crowns, and coins that fueled the imperial machine. It was the splendor that sustained banquets, temples, and most importantly, the legions. Each gold coin represented a soldier fed, a ship built, a road paved. The metal wasn't just wealth, it was the engine that kept Rome constantly moving. The curious thing is how gold carried enormous symbolic weight. It wasn't just used to pay, but also to impress. Emperors displayed golden crowns and statues as proof of absolute power. Imagine entering a Roman palace and seeing columns gleaming in the sun, all financed by the sweat of miners hidden deep within the earth. It's as if every ounce of gold extracted was transformed into a spectacle for the masses. Military financing was perhaps its most strategic use. With gold, Rome paid its legions, ensuring loyalty and discipline. Without it, there would be no expansion, no secure borders. It was an investment with a quick return. More gold financed wars,
and more wars brought new territories with more mines to exploit, a nearly endless cycle until the land itself began to run out. But for the miners, this gold meant only weight in their baskets and wounds on their shoulders. They never saw their wealth transformed into palaces, only mud mixed with the raw ore.
It's similar to the modern feeling of working on something grand without ever sharing in the fruits, like a bricklayer who builds luxurious mansions but lives in humble conditions. The glitter of gold was a privilege for the few. And there was the paradox. As the empire grew ever richer, the men who generated that wealth became increasingly poor in health, time, and dignity. It's a reminder of how power and suffering often go hand in hand. Gold sustained Rome, but it drained lives in the process. And when we think of suffering, it is impossible to ignore that work in the mines was seen as one of the most severe punishments in the empire, reserved for those who dared to challenge its authority. In the vast system of Roman punishments, few were as feared as being condemned to the mines, while some prisoners ended up in the arenas to face wild beasts or gladiators. Others suffered an even crueler fate, being sent down into the depths of the earth and disappearing there. For Rome, there was no difference between an immediate death sentence and being sent to the mines. The latter only prolonged the agony. This type of punishment was reserved for those who committed serious crimes or enemies captured in war. It was a way to transform unwanted bodies into a workforce. The empire wasted nothing. If they couldn't be useful citizens, they would at least offer sweat and blood in exchange for wealth. Today, when we think of the prison system, we think of cells and walls. Back then, the cell was underground and the walls were solid stone. The condemned had no release date. They entered the mines without knowing if they would ever see the light of day again. It was a punishment with no return, one that robbed them not only of their freedom but also of their hope. Imagine being led into a dark tunnel with chains on your feet and realizing that this suffocating space would be your home until the end. It's hard not to feel utter despair. The most perverse aspect was the indifference with which Rome viewed this punishment. For the elites, it was just another cog in the works. It mattered little whether the prisoner was a thief, a political rebel, or simply someone in the wrong place at the wrong time. The mine leveled everyone down, crushing any identity. The only thing left was physical exertion until the body could take no more. And this fate didn't just frighten the prisoners, it served as an example to all free citizens. It was a constant reminder that defying Rome could lead to a life buried in damp vaults. Fear was a political weapon, as powerful as the marching legions. The silence of the mines echoed like a warning to all of society, but even more frightening than the fear of punishment was the reality of what was happening inside, where many accounts describe the experience not as work, but as a slow and inevitable form of death. For those who've never descended into a Roman mine, it can be difficult to imagine what it was like to live there, but some ancient authors didn't mince words when describing that fate. Mining was seen as a death in installments. There was no glory, no spectacle like in the amphitheaters. It was just a body slowly fading away, sucked into darkness, dust, and fatigue. The cruelest thing was the feeling of imprisonment. The miner saw no horizon, only narrow tunnels and damp walls. It was like living inside a tomb while still alive. Anyone who has spent long periods indoors without windows knows how time seems to lose its meaning. Imagine that same feeling multiplied by years, with no rest and no prospect of escape. The body slowly deteriorated. First came back pain, then a persistent cough, until breathing became difficult. Each day stole a piece of vitality. It wasn't a sudden death,
but a gradual fading. It was like watching a candle slowly melt, consumed down to the last thread of wax. The accounts also speak of the loss of identity. Inside the mines, no one was a citizen, a foreigner, or a prisoner of war. Everyone became mere shadows, indistinct workers in the darkness. This dilution of individuality increased the psychological burden. When someone has no name, only a function, life becomes even more disposable. Today, when we talk about inhumane work, we think of exhausting hours or dangerous environments. But compared to the Roman mines, almost anything seems bearable. There, the work wasn't just hard, it was a continuous sentence, a reduced existence awaiting the end. It's no wonder that writers of the time described mining with tones of lamentation, almost like funeral poetry. And if ancient accounts already revealed this brutality, imagine how the role of supervisors was viewed, charged with maintaining order and extracting maximum production without any room for compassion. In the Roman mines, the constant presence of soldiers reminded everyone that there was no room for rest or rebellion. Armed and disciplined, they were not there to work, but to watch. Their eyes followed every movement, as if each miner were a prisoner about to escape. The sound of chains on their weapons echoed as a warning. Any slip-up would have immediate consequences. Imperial administrators, in turn, were all about the numbers. They didn't see faces, just quantities of ore mined, cargo transported, and deadlines met. It was a cold, almost mathematical management style. Today, when we think of bosses who care more about results than people, we already feel uncomfortable. Now, imagine this taken to the extreme, with no labor laws, no rights, just demands. This surveillance created a suffocating atmosphere. The miner not only faced the dust and weight of the rocks, but also the constant gaze of those who could punish him. Physical oppression was compounded by psychological oppression. It was as if the dark tunnel closed in even further with the presence of armed power. Working wasn't a choice, it was an imposition accompanied by a threat. Discipline was strict. Anyone who stopped to rest outside of normal hours received severe punishments, whippings, deprivation of food, or even isolation in even worse conditions. The idea of humanity disappeared. It was as if the supervisors saw the miners not as people, but as tools that need to be constantly forced to work. And most intriguingly, this militarized oversight reflected the very spirit of the empire: order, control, and efficiency at any cost. Rome prided itself on its organizational capabilities, but for the miners, this order was just another form of imprisonment. The rigor that sustained Roman glory slowly crushed those who made it possible. And under this relentless supervision, many were forced to work in mines so deep that even air became an enemy, making the simple task of breathing a nearly impossible endeavor. The deeper the miners descended, the heavier the air became. The sensation was one of slowly suffocating, as if the environment event were conspiring against them. There were no windows, no drafts, just trapped heat and thin oxygen. Breathing was an act of courage. Today, when we step into a crowded elevator and feel short of breath, we can hardly imagine what it was like to spend hours in suffocating tunnels. The torches, though necessary for seeing, made the situation worse. They consumed the little oxygen available and released smoke, which mixed with the rock dust. The air became thick, almost palpable. Many workers reported dizziness, nausea, and even sudden. Anyone who has been in a closed hot room for a long time knows the feeling, but in the mines, there was no way to open the window for relief. Depth also brought silence and isolation. The further they traveled from the surface, the less contact they had with the outside world. The sound of the wind disappeared, the scent of nature faded, and only the claustrophobic atmosphere remained. It was like living inside a body that didn't breathe, as if the earth itself were swallowing them. This solitude amplified the psychological burden, making each journey even heavier. The Romans tried some rudimentary solutions, such as digging ventilation shafts or using air currents forced by agitated blankets, but these resources were limited and ineffective. Technology didn't keep pace with ambition. The desire to explore ever deeper was costly. Bodies fell, lives shortened, the mind swallowed up those who dared to defy its depth. And the paradox was clear. The deeper, the more valuable the ore found. The brilliance hidden in the bowels of the earth had a price measured in ragged breaths and endless coughs. Wealth was born where air barely reached. It was as if Rome were saying that for every shiny coin, someone had paid with the simple right to breathe. And it wasn't just the lack of air that was threatening. There were also risky techniques involving fire, used to open passages in resistant rocks, but which brought even greater danger. Inside the mines, when the rock proved too resistant to pickaxes, the Romans resorted to an ingenious and risky technique. They lit large fires against the walls, allowing the heat to penetrate deep into the stone. The crackling of the fire mixed with the strong smell of smoke, creating an even more suffocating atmosphere. Then they suddenly poured cold water, causing violent cracks. It was the earth screaming in dry cracks. This process, called fire setting, required courage and composure. Imagine being in a narrow tunnel, surrounded by flames and smoke, knowing that tons of rock could soon give way. Many workers were covered in soot, coughing incessantly. Anyone who has ever poured cold water over a hot plate knows the shrill noise this caused. Now multiply this scene on a mountainous scale inside a closed mine. The heat was unbearable. Their faces burned. The air seemed to inflame their lungs, and their eyes stung as if filled with sand. Some miners improvised wet cloths to cover their faces, trying to withstand the nearly unbreathable environment. It was like working inside a furnace, and when the water finally reached the rock, the cracking sound echoed like subterranean thunder, followed by fragments flying in all directions. The danger of collapse was constant. Many galleries gave way after the technique was applied, burying workers who barely had time to react. The empire accepted these losses as part of the process.
After all, what mattered was the exposed metal after the crack. Today, when we talk about workplace safety, this practice would sound like absolute folly. But back then, it was the innovation available. And yet, despite everything, the method worked. By allowing access to previously inaccessible ore veins, fire expanded mining capacity. The cost, however, was paid in human lives and the accelerated destruction of the subterranean environment. The price of progress once again fell on those who had no choice. And precisely because this technique is so dangerous, it is no surprise that collapses and accidents were frequent, reinforcing the reputation of mines as death traps that could swallow dozens in a matter of seconds. The fire-heated walls seemed to give way easily, but they hid a lethal risk. The thermal shock weakened the rocks unpredictably, and what began as a mere crack could suddenly turn into a collapse. The miners lived under the constant shadow of this danger. Each crack echoed like a warning that the earth could collapse at any moment, crushing everything around it. The cruelest part was that no one could predict when it would happen. Some days, technique worked without major incident. On others, one false move was enough for tons of rocks to collapse. Imagine working under a roof that you knew could collapse at any moment. This feeling of vulnerability corroded the mind as much as the body. The collapses not only took lives, but also buried entire days' worth of work. Carefully dug tunnels were destroyed in seconds, forcing survivors to start over from scratch. It's like when a computer crashes and you lose an entire file, except in this case, the losses were human and irreversible.
Frustration compounded the silent grief. Rome, however, didn't see tragedies, but statistics. For administrators, each accident was just part of a cost-benefit calculation. If 10 people died, but the mine produced enough gold or silver, the balance was considered positive. It's hard to see how economic logic overrode any notion of human value, and even knowing the risks, the miners had no choice. The fear of dying, buried beneath the earth, competed with the fear of punishment if they refused to work. It was a hopeless dilemma: face the unstable rock, or face the wrath of the empire. In both cases, the margin for hope was slim, and if the collapses already demonstrated the violence of work, there was still the weight of the paradox. While lives were crushed under tons of stone, Rome strengthened itself economically, building its greatness on foundations of invisible suffering. The Roman Empire flourished in wealth, but every coin minted bore invisible marks: the roads connecting provinces, the marble palaces, the lavish banquets. All of these had a hidden human cost. It was the miners' lives, slowly consumed, that sustained the capital's luster. It is as if the visible glory were merely the sunny face of a much darker shadow. The Roman economy relied heavily on mined metals. Gold-fueled military campaigns, silver-fueled trade, and iron-strengthened armies. Every conquest, every expansion depended on resources from the subsoil. Imagine the legions marching triumphantly. Behind them was the sweat of men who would never see the light of victory, buried in sweltering tunnels. This economic growth, however, was not distributed. While the elite accumulated wealth, the miners lived on the edge of survival. The contrast was stark. It's similar to certain moments in modern history when nations grow statistically, but their poorest populations continue to suffer. Rome grew in numbers, but diminished in humanity. Even writers of the time recognized this imbalance. For some, mining was a living metaphor. While some reaped golden fruits, others withered invisibly. This insight shows that, even in ancient times, there were those who saw the price of inequality. But in the face of the imperial machine, these voices rarely changed the course of history. Still, the economic legacy was undeniable. Rome built its greatness on these riches, but it also left behind a trail of physical and social destruction. Growth had two sides, one that filled the coffers, the other that emptied lives. It's a lesson that resonates to this day. Prosperity without humanity exacts sky-high interest rates, and among those who reflected on this paradox were observers like Pliny the Elder, who recorded, with some astonishment, the almost inhuman harshness of life in the mines. Pliny the Elder, one of the greatest observers of ancient Rome, did not ignore the cruelty of the mine. In his accounts, he described with amazement the courage, or rather, the resignation, of the men who descended into the earth every day. To him, mining seemed like a constant battle against nature and against his own body. Reading his words is like hearing a distant echo of compassion amid an empire that cared little for anonymous lives.
These records show that even at the height of Roman glory, there were those who recognized the dark side of wealth. While the city boasted theaters, aqueducts, and imposing forums, some intellectuals understood that all this cost too much in human terms. It's like today, when someone criticizes great modern works that conceal the exploitation of workers. The attentive eye always finds cracks behind the shiny facade. Pliny wasn't alone, but his voice gained prominence precisely because he observed details others preferred to ignore. He spoke of dust, disease, and accidents, small scenes that revealed the daily lives of those who sustained the empire with their lives. This sensitivity set him apart, demonstrating that even within Rome there were consciences uneasy about inequality. These descriptions also served as a warning. By showing the price paid in sweat and blood, Pliny offered the reader an opportunity to reflect. The gold and silver gleamed, but they carried with them stories of suffering that could not be erased. It was as if he were saying, before admiring luxury, remember who made it possible. Still, even these critical voices didn't change the miner's reality. The empire continued to exploit, indifferently, because the economic engine couldn't, but the writings remained as testimony that someone, somewhere, saw and recorded. It's memory that endures when life has already been ripped away. And when speaking of life in the mines, Pliny also reminds us of how entire communities revolved around these activities, living in the shadow of the forced labor that sustained Rome. In mining regions, it wasn't just the workers who lived in the shadow of the mine. Entire villages formed around them, and the local economy revolved around what emerged from underground. Small traders sold bread, wine, and tools. Women washed clothes impregnated with metallic dust. Children grew up hearing the sound of pickaxes as if it were a natural part of life. The mine was the beating heart, albeit sickly, of each community. The dependence was so great that even those who didn't descend into the tunnels felt the burden of mining in their daily lives. If production fell, commerce weakened. If the mine shut down due to a collapse, the entire village went into crisis. It's similar to modern cities that depend on a single industry. When it fails, everyone suffers. Rome replicated this pattern on an ancient scale, transforming entire villages into mining satellites. Social ties were also shaped by this reality. Families grew accustomed to prolonged absences, as many miners never returned home. Widows and orphans were common sights in neighboring communities. Silent mourning spread, but at the same time it was stifled by the need to continue living. Bread had to be bought, wine served, and life went on, even with open wounds. For some, proximity to the mine meant opportunity. Some profited by providing supplies to supervisors or buying metals in side trades, but these were few. Most lived between resignation and survival, accepting that the mine determined everyone's fate. It was a collective prison, albeit an invisible one, and it's interesting to see how this dynamic created a kind of normalization of suffering. When everyone around you experiences the same pain, it begins to seem routine, a natural part of existence. What we would call exploitation today was then simply life as it is. But even this seemingly solid life began to unravel as the empire declined. And over time, when Rome no longer had the same strength as before, many of these mines were simply abandoned, leaving behind deep scars and forgotten stories. As Rome began to lose its breath, the mines, once pulsating with activity, fell silent. Tunnels that once echoed with hammering and the shouts of supervisors were now filled with the sound of dripping water and the rustling of small animals. Abandonment came gradually, almost invisibly, as the empire no longer had enough resources or men to keep the machinery running. The surrounding communities felt the immediate impact. Where there had once been commerce and currency circulation, ruins and poverty remained. Taverns closed, small markets disappeared, and families who indirectly depended on the mines had to seek sustenance elsewhere. It's like modern cities collapsing when a giant factory closes its doors, transforming once busy streets into empty spaces. Little by little, nature began to reclaim what was hers. Vegetation grew over tunnel entrances, rivers returned to their natural course, and silence covered but traces remained. Broken stones, artificial canals, metal residue. It was a reminder that even though the empire's glory had faded, the scars of mining would remain etched in the soil. Oblivion, however, was not complete. Some explorers and later peoples ventured into the ancient tunnels, searching for traces of ore. For them, it was like rummaging through the abandoned chest of a sleeping giant. But they almost always encountered more danger than riches: cave-ins, flooded passages, thin air. The earth seemed to exact a price from those who dared to poke at old wounds. And this abandonment also brought a curious paradox. What was once a symbol of progress has become ruin. What sustained empires has become empty caves, reminders of a time of excess. It is proof that even the greatest powers leave forgotten traces as the wheel of history turns. And even though forgotten, many of these mines still exist, hidden beneath our feet, reminding us that ancient Rome continues to breathe through its ruins. In the fields of Hispania, in the hills of Gaul, and even on the slopes of Egypt, you can still find traces of Roman miners, narrow tunnels, abandoned galleries, and rusted pieces of tools. All these remain silent testaments to centuries of exploration. Walking through these places today is like listening to a distant echo, each stone telling a story that time has not been able to erase. Modern archaeologists and explorers venture into these remains, often with sophisticated equipment to ensure safety. The contrast is stark. Where today we use LED flashlights, there were once smoking torches. Where today there is supplemental oxygen, before there were only lungs forced to endure. Technology illuminates the brutality of the past. These ruins also help us understand how Rome structured its economy and logistics. Remains of canals, drainage systems, and slag deposits show that despite the precarious conditions for workers, there was organization and strategy. It's like finding the blueprints of an ancient factory. Even in ruins, they reveal the genius and, at the same time, the cruelty of the project. For today's communities, these places are also points of memory and identity. Many have become archaeological sites or tourist destinations. Visitors walk through tunnels where 2,000 years ago, exhausted men walked. Tourism today generates profit where once there was only pain, demonstrating how history can be reinterpreted over time. And yet the atmosphere of these places still carries something heavy. The silence inside the tunnels is different, almost suffocating, as if it harbors the echo of those who never left. It's a reminder that the wealth that built empires came at a great cost. The landscape may change, but the memory imprinted in the stone is eternal. And as you observe these persistent traces, it's impossible not to reflect on what they represent, a reminder that Rome's greatness was born of both visible achievements and invisible sacrifices. Behind the marble columns, majestic temples, and military victories, there lay a hidden face of ancient Rome. The history of the miners shows that every visible triumph of the empire had a price paid in silence, hidden deep within the earth. It is as if Rome's gilded foundation was cemented not only with stone and metal, but also with sweat, blood, and sacrificed lives. This contrast is profound. While the elite enjoyed banquets and luxuries, thousands breathed toxic dust in sweltering tunnels. The empire prided itself on its greatness, but greatness for whom? The question echoes to this day. Whenever we think of civilizations built on the exploitation of the weakest, the glitter of coins and jewels reflected only half the truth. Roman miners rarely appear in history books, but they were the ones who sustained the imperial machine. Without the gold, silver, iron, copper, and lead extracted at the cost of their lives,
Rome would not have achieved such power. They are invisible protagonists, like so many anonymous hands that still build the monuments of our modern world. Their suffering also invites us to reflect on the present. How often do we consume products without considering who produced them or the conditions under which they were made? The Roman mines are a distant but revealing mirror. They show that inequality and the human cost of progress are not inventions of the present, but simply recur in new forms. And despite all the pain, its history has not been lost. The ruins, the records, and even the environmental scars are witnesses that have spanned centuries, reminding us of an uncomfortable fact. Rome's glory was not only built, it was torn away, often by force. This invisible legacy pulses to this day, hidden in the shadows of every achievement humanity celebrates. And it is precisely in this paradox between greatness and suffering that our introduction begins, which will invite the viewer to delve into this narrative in an engaging and reflective way. Now that you know this forgotten face of the Roman Empire, the question remains, what do we do with this knowledge today? It's no use simply admiring history. We need to reflect on it. If Rome's glory was sustained by the sacrifice of so many invisible people, do we somehow still repeat this pattern in our modern society? How many of today's riches also hide stories of suffering? Think about it. Every product you consume, every technology you use, may carry a tiny piece of human effort you'll never see. The story of the Roman miners isn't just a distant tale. It's an uncomfortable mirror that forces us to question our own choices. Are you willing to see beyond the glitter? And what's more, what will you do with this reflection? Will you just watch and go about your daily life? Or will you transform this knowledge into active awareness? Perhaps share this story. Perhaps rethink your consumption habits. Perhaps engage in causes that value human lives over numbers. The point is, change begins the moment we decide not to ignore it. Tell me in the comments what part of this story surprised you the most. What part made you think differently? Your opinion might open others' eyes too. And if you want to continue exploring these profound stories which reveal secrets behind what seems obvious, subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell. Here you'll always find content that doesn't just remain superficial but delves deep, as we just did together.